Behind every unhealthy bond lies a subtle force, one that quietly tugs at your emotions, influencing thoughts and behaviors, often without your knowledge. What if you could unmask the hidden hands that keep you bound, learning not just to recognize manipulative tactics, but to defend your identity against them? This book is not your typical self-help guide. Instead, it delves into the shadows of psychological manipulation, exposing the silent methods some use to maintain control and keep others emotionally captive. With each page, you will gain stronger insight and practical tools to claim your independence, step out of toxic patterns, and reclaim your peace of mind. Will you dare to confront what holds your spirit hostage? Independent Heart, Letting Go of Toxic Attachments, written and published by Stealth Psychology. Chapter 1. Recognizing Unhealthy Emotional Ties. Imagine a dinner party where laughter fills the room, but under the table, a subtle tension cuts through the air. Jen sits beside her partner Mark, who outwardly greets her friends but keeps a gentle grip on her hand, squeezing just a little too tightly when conversations wander to topics he dislikes. After the guests leave, Mark calmly questions Jen about every conversation, making her justify her words and friendships one by one. To outsiders, everything seems normal. Jen's friends sense nothing amiss, assuming his protectiveness is care, not control. Yet within the four walls of their home, Mark uses gentle words mixed with silent accusations, a carefully crafted cocktail of love and uncertainty that binds Jen to him more tightly than any locked door ever could. What Mark wants is not simply affection, it is dominance disguised as devotion. His ultimate goal is to shape Jen's world so thoroughly that her sense of autonomy shrinks, her confidence wilts, and her eyes no longer stray beyond his circle. These are the beginnings of psychological manipulation, where the trap is laid quietly, strand by strand. Victims like Jen rarely recognize the growing chains. Each small concession seems harmless at first, just figments of compromise for love or peace. The manipulator weaves together compliments and criticisms with the same thread, expertly blurring the line between affection and authority. In time, confusion deepens as the victim questions their reality, suspects themselves, and begins to anxiously self-monitor, hoping to avoid the next subtle reprimand or chilly silence. Financial exploitation sometimes rides alongside this emotional mastery. The manipulator may offer to take care of everything, insisting it's for the sake of convenience or unity, while gradually closing the doors to financial independence. A partner might suggest closing a personal bank account in favor of a joint one, or create guilt around separate spending. The victim, at first flattered by this overture of trust, gradually discovers that what was offered as unity now serves as surveillance. Control is quietly established, not by force, but by warmth, persuasive reasoning, and a deft twisting of mutual goals. By the time the victim realizes what's truly happening, the walls have closed in, making escape seem daunting and independence almost unthinkable. Social isolation often follows, imposed subtly through comments about certain friends. Maybe they seem a little selfish, or perhaps their influence isn't quite right for your relationship. Invitations dwindle, excuses multiply, and the victim finds their social world shrinking. What initially appears to be loving exclusivity morphs into solitary confinement by another name. Once again, it happens so gradually that the victim does not recognize the gates closing until the room has grown quiet, and the only remaining voice is that of the manipulator. Recognizing these unhealthy emotional ties is the first step out of the shadows. Manipulators are expert illusionists, blending concerns and care into a mask that conceals their true intent. Only by naming the tactics and daring to look at them in the cold light of truth can one begin to reclaim power over their choices. This chapter is the crack in the facade, revealing how perfectly ordinary acts can, in truth, be the earliest signs of unseen captivity. Once psychological manipulation takes root, its effects permeate every emotional layer of a person's life. Emotions no longer flow from authentic thoughts and spontaneous reactions, but are instead distorted by persistent self-doubt and confusion. The manipulated individual might find themselves apologizing for things they never did wrong, constantly anxious about upsetting the other person, and tiptoeing around invisible boundaries. The normal rhythms of joy, peace, and disappointment are clouded, replaced by a deepening uncertainty that saps vitality and motivation. Even the smallest decisions, what to wear, who to call, where to spend time, become loaded with the pressure to anticipate the manipulator's preferences, erasing the sense of choice and personal expression. Over time, a creeping numbness may settle in, as an endless background anxiety makes true emotional comfort unreachable. This insidious process deeply damages relationships, warping the meaning of intimacy and affection. In a study by the American Psychological Association, researchers found that individuals subjected to long-term relational manipulation reported feeling isolated not only from their social circles, but also from their own instincts and values. One participant in the study explained how his partner's steady stream of little corrections, criticizing who he spent time with, where he worked, even the way he prepared meals, slowly stripped him of confidence. He began to anticipate her displeasure in things before they happened, and eventually stopped meeting friends, editing himself into a shadow of the person he once was. In a similar documented case, a woman whose finances were incrementally placed under her partner's supervision believed she was being taken care of, only to realize years later she no longer had the agency to make large or small decisions for herself. The emotional bond between manipulator and victim becomes a tangle of guilt, gratitude, dependence, and fear, oppressive and suffocating in equal measure. Why do so many people, often intelligent and capable, fall into these psychological traps? The answer is rarely simple. Manipulation wears countless disguises: love, concern, guidance, even laughter. Cultural messages reinforce self-sacrifice and compromise as relationship virtues, blurring the line between what is healthy and what is controlling. The early phases of manipulation are marked by kindness and attention so overwhelming that the eventual slide into control feels like a natural, if confusing, progression. Research from the University of California, Berkeley identifies this as the compliance trap, where repeated small concessions set the stage for larger and more damaging acquiescence. Each minor instance of compliance is manageable in isolation and often seems justified at the time. It is in their accumulation, like waves wearing away a stone, that they hollow out self-esteem and autonomy. Self-esteem erodes slowly under these conditions. The manipulated individual may initially stand up for themselves, only to face subtle or overt punishment, coldness, withdrawal, or guilt trips. Eventually, it feels easier to surrender than to argue, and this surrender feeds upon itself, diminishing the belief in one's worth and the right to happiness on one's own terms. Long-lost ambitions, friendships, and hobbies bear silent witness to the systematic shrinking of the self. Relationship dynamics grow fraught with dependency and silent resentment, making it almost impossible for the victim to imagine a reality outside the manipulator's shadow. Understanding how these destructive ties take hold is not only vital, but urgent. The next section will pierce through the illusion, uncovering the hidden warning signs most people never realize are the earliest indicators of impending manipulation. Manipulators rarely act at random. In most cases, they select their targets with the subtlety of a predator studying its environment, looking for those most susceptible to specific tactics. The first distinguishing sign of a target might be recent vulnerability. Perhaps a person has experienced a loss, a breakup, or upheaval at work. Such transitional periods make individuals more open to reassurance and guidance, searching for stability in a world temporarily thrown off balance. A manipulator recognizes these unspoken signals: the tentative smile, the longing for approval, the hesitance to create conflict. They step quietly into the victim's life with a soothing presence, offering exactly what is needed: validation, attention, even a sense of rescue. But if the bait is sweet, the hook runs deep. Consider the story of Anthony, who after relocating for a new job found himself isolated in a city of strangers. His charismatic supervisor quickly offered after-hours camaraderie and championed Anthony's efforts in front of others, providing the social anchor Anthony craved. In private, though, subtle expectations emerged: working late without overtime, overlooking ethical irregularities, and distancing himself from colleagues outside the supervisor's circle. When Anthony hesitated, reminders about team loyalty and gratitude for help during his lonely arrival made compliance feel not only logical, but an unspoken debt. Over time, Anthony noticed his range of choices shrinking, with each favor paid for in personal sacrifice. The subtlety of the escalation meant that for Anthony, the process felt natural, almost invisible. Manipulators are equally adept in the context of romantic relationships or family dynamics. One case involved Emily, a recent divorcee, who found new hope in her friendship with a neighbor, Sylvia. Initially, Sylvia's warmth felt like a lifeline, inviting Emily for dinners, offering to run errands, and covering minor expenses. Gradually, Emily began to rely on Sylvia for advice on everything from child-rearing to finances. This dependency, however, became suffocating as Sylvia questioned Emily's decisions, undermined her confidence, and subtly withheld support when Emily tried to break away. The benevolence at its core was a system of calculated investments that drew a net around Emily's freedom. Her isolation deepened while Sylvia, the helpful friend, became the essential gatekeeper to Emily's new world. These real-life scenarios illustrate not just the tactics, but the subtle psychological shifts that unfold during manipulation. Victims often experience an incremental hollowing out of self-assurance. With each manipulated compromise, the grip of the manipulator tightens. The internal dialogue of the victim gradually changes. They second-guess their instincts, attribute successes to the manipulator's influence, and silently rationalize disrespect as kindness or miscommunication. A creeping dependence replaces inner trust as approval from the manipulator becomes a measure of self-worth. Emotional forecasting, the habit of anticipating how the manipulator will respond to every thought and action, eventually governs the victim's choices, erasing spontaneity and individuality. The imperative insight here is that seeing these tactics for what they are is the crucial first step to resistance. Knowledge becomes armor. When you can recognize repeated patterns and spot the subtle dance of dependency, you are better equipped to challenge these dynamics rather than succumb to them. As you reflect on these scenarios, ask yourself where these patterns have surfaced in your own life or the lives of others you know. This conscious awareness can be the first act of rebellion, a door slowly creaking open to reclaim power. In the next part, we will examine how the manipulator's tactics intensify and how victims become ensnared in self-perpetuating cycles of control, silence, and compliance. Chapter 2. Understanding Your Inner Worth. In a small office bathed by the blue glow from computer screens, Megan sits at her desk, her hands trembling slightly as she reviews a document she's rewritten 3 times. Each revision has been completed at her manager's subtle yet unyielding urging, never stated outright, but always implied in the sideways glance, the overt disappointment, the shifting standards that never remain still. Privately, her manager has built Megan up as an indispensable worker, lavishing her with praise during team meetings, calling her a rising star, yet eroding her confidence behind closed doors through methodical critiques and an insidious questioning of her judgment. Over weeks, Megan's nights fill with worry and self-doubt, her sense of accomplishment dissolving one comment at a time. The manipulator's true intent is masked behind a professional smile, yet the goal is crystal clear. Megan's compliance is non-negotiable, her self-perception slowly unmoored until her loyalty and effort can be harvested, unchallenged and absolute. What makes this scenario especially disturbing is Megan's increasing blindness to her own value. While her abilities are constantly praised in public, she notices that she cannot make a single decision without first questioning whether it will displease her manager. When advice is given, it is delivered with the weight of authority and concern. Phrases like, "I just want you to succeed," or "You have so much potential if you'd only listen." Each comment lodges in Megan's mind, and over time, her reliance on external validation grows until her own judgment becomes nothing more than an echo of her manager's opinions. What once felt like meaningful independence now feels fragile, constantly at risk of shattering under the threat of disappointment. Megan's story reveals how easy it is for people to lose sight of their own inner worth when up against a manipulator who camouflages control inside layers of encouragement and subtle intimidation. Victims often miss the silent hemorrhaging of self-esteem at the hands of someone who supposedly wants the best for them. Initially, the manipulator's interest and attention are interpreted as guidance, a welcome hand amid uncertainty. It is the gradual nature of the erosion, one seed of doubt planted at a time, that lulls even the most self-assured into a false sense of security. In many cases, by the time Megan or someone like her looks up and tries to piece together their own worth, the foundation supporting their autonomy has already been sapped. The manipulator's ultimate aim is total emotional leverage. The victim is kept tethered by hope of regaining former approval while fearing its permanent withdrawal. Seeing oneself through the eyes of a manipulator distorts reality. Each question, each raised eyebrow, reverberates louder than one's accomplishments or dreams. This loss of perspective is rarely recognized in the moment, because the manipulator builds their control with the language of love, ambition, or care. The real danger lies in the gradual internalization of these messages, leaving victims questioning whether their inner voice matters at all. As this chapter continues, the anatomy of worth and its theft will be explored, revealing depths most people have never dared to see. When someone no longer recognizes their internal worth, every facet of their life can become compromised. Emotionally, the victim experiences a slow-moving storm. Shame, dread, and confusion become constant companions, replacing confidence and inner peace. Small mistakes or imagined faults loom enormous, each misstep amplified by the manipulator's gaze, real or anticipated. Over time, this heightened emotional state weakens a person's resilience, making recovery from setbacks feel impossible. Fear becomes the language of their internal monologue, and every positive feeling, joy, pride, hope, is overshadowed by anxiety about keeping the manipulator pleased. Decision-making falters under this pressure. Choices that once came easily now require agonizing introspection, followed by second-guessing and even guilt triggered by the manipulator's reactions. If a partner, colleague, or parent expects approval to be sought before all decisions, the victim's sense of competence and agency fades. Confidence seeps away, often unnoticed, until they feel lost in even ordinary situations. Simple questions such as, "What do you want?" can seem impossible to answer, as victims learn to minimize their preferences, sacrificing them to the manipulator's agenda. The deterioration of relationships happens in parallel, as the victim's self-doubt breeds isolation. Old friends, those who once reinforced the person's authentic identity, are often distanced or dismissed under the manipulator's influence. Conversation grows tentative. Spontaneity dies. The person who used to laugh freely now worries that an offhand remark might be used against them later. This dynamic was clear in a documented case involving a woman named Sarah, whose partner, over years, systematically questioned her choices, belittled her successes, and praised her only when it brought him advantage. As Sarah's sense of value diminished, even her family noticed she smiled less, argued less, and faded from group activities. The manipulator's campaign, both deliberate and insidious, subordinated Sarah's life until she felt invisible, an accessory in her own story. Research from Stanford University has highlighted how persistent negative feedback drastically erodes self-esteem, especially in those who seek connection and affirmation from others. People fall for such manipulation for a variety of reasons. First among them is the universal need for belonging. Most people want to be valued, supported, and taken seriously by those they love or respect. Manipulators understand this instinct and wield it expertly, alternating praise and criticism to create a psychological dependency. Another study published in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships described the concept of learned helplessness in relationships, describing how repeated cycles of approval followed by rejection break down the ability to maintain one's self-view. The sought-after affirmation becomes addictive, ever rarer, and more desperately craved. Even intelligent, self-aware individuals can be seduced by this intermittent reward-punishment structure, mistaking it for passion, discipline, or tough love. The insidiousness of these tactics lies in their invisibility. Most victims do not realize their worth has eroded until their voice is barely recognizable, until their dreams feel irrelevant or impossibly distant. Genuine enthusiasm, ambition, and a sense of belonging have been hollowed out, as though an invisible hand siphoned them away. To witness the early signs of this manipulation is to disrupt the cycle before the roots have strangled the self. The next section will shine a light on the overlooked warning signs, breaking through the darkness of denial and awakening the ability to defend your worth. Manipulators have an uncanny knack for recognizing latent vulnerabilities in others. They seem drawn almost instinctively to those in transition or distress. Someone recently grieving, relocating to a new environment, ending a relationship, or experiencing uncertainty about their place in the world. These life events often cause a natural drop in self-confidence, making the search for affirmation or guidance all the more intense. The manipulator moves in quietly, alert to hesitation in a conversation, remarks about self-doubt, or even expressions of gratitude for small acts of kindness. These cues are interpreted as openings, signifying a thirst for reassurance, approval, or belonging. Quickly, the manipulator offers what feels like genuine interest or defense. Compliments, gestures of help, and empathetic listening flow freely in the beginning. Yet beneath the surface, a slow campaign to reshape the victim's identity begins. Take, for example, the experience of David, whose work performance had begun to slip after his parents' divorce and illness. His supervisor, Mr. Crane, offered supportive words and regular feedback, usually cloaked as mentorship. Over weeks, these sessions morphed into opportunities for subtle downplaying of David's skills, guidance that called into question his instincts, and rallies of praise only when David echoed Mr. Crane's ideas or methods. David's growing reliance on external affirmation gradually shifted his personal goal from autonomy to constant pleasing of his mentor. What began as a professional relationship devoted to growth became, without obvious signs, a magnetic center around which David's sense of worth orbited. Even outside work, his self-doubt deepened as the fear of disappointing Mr. Crane began spilling over into his relationships and private ambitions. Consider also the story of Lena, a first-year college student far from home and newly exposed to the demands of rigorous academics. Her roommate, Stephanie, excelled not only in school but also socially, and quickly took Lena under her wing. Stephanie helped Lena pick classes, invited her to gatherings, and even managed Lena's late-night anxieties about fitting in. Over a semester, Stephanie's advice morphed into subtle critiques, mocking Lena's fashion, dismissing ambitions as unrealistic, and pushing her away from certain classmates. Lena began shrinking her dreams, deferring to Stephanie's preferences, and finding her self-image tied exclusively to the approval of her trusted roommate. Although everyone around her praised Stephanie's nurturing, Lena was guided every day further from her core self, her thoughts and emotions invaded by Stephanie's judgments. These examples display the gradual psychological shifts inherent in manipulation. Targets feel their opinions blur, their confidence fragment, and their authentic desires put on mute. Self-assurance is replaced with dependence, not abrupt enough to be obvious, but insistent enough to erode definable boundaries. As dependency deepens, internal narratives are rewritten. Maybe I'm not as smart or strong as I thought. Maybe it's better to let them decide. These new scripts shape beliefs, actions, and self-value, leaving the victim unaware that what they now accept as truth has been delicately implanted by another. To guard your well-being, understanding these manipulative strategies is essential. Insight is the first, irreplaceable weapon in the fight for emotional autonomy. Recognizing when a pattern repeats from context to context provides the earliest possible defense. As we go forward, the next section will explore how manipulation inevitably escalates, tightening its hold, amplifying control, and drawing the victim into vicious psychological cycles that can seem, at first, unbreakable. If this perspective is meaningful to you, consider staying engaged with our journey and supporting this mission to spread awareness. Chapter 3. Releasing Guilt and Obligation. Picture Helen, a devoted daughter, sitting in her dimly lit kitchen long after the rest of her family has gone to bed. Her phone buzzes with yet another message from her mother, who has a history of health anxieties and frequent emotional outbursts. Tonight, it's another lament about being abandoned, a reminder of all the sacrifices made for Helen throughout her childhood, and a questioning of where such loyalty has gone. Even after hours spent that day delivering groceries and listening to her mother's woes, Helen's chest tightens with shame and duty, as if she has not done enough and never will. She responds with apologies, promises to visit again soon, and reassurances that she does care, yet she knows, deep down, that the cycle will repeat itself weeks or even days from now. Her mother's words come laced with subtle threats and sorrow. "No one ever takes care of me but you," and "I just wish I mattered more in your life." Each statement finds its way into Helen's mind, rewriting boundaries and weaving a tight web of guilt. The manipulator in Helen's life does not issue orders or obvious demands. Instead, she cloaks her true intentions in the language of helplessness and victimhood. The ultimate goal here is not just emotional control, but a kind of permanent emotional anchoring. By using guilt as a lever, Helen's mother ensures her presence and compliance without ever having to ask directly. Over the years, Helen has internalized the message that her mother's well-being rests solely on her shoulders, a burden so intense that every attempt at autonomy feels selfish, even cruel. She questions her own motivations, sacrificing rest, personal growth, and friendships to ease her mother's loneliness. The sense of duty no longer comes from love or respect, but from an unrelenting fear of causing pain or being labeled ungrateful. This manipulation is uniquely insidious because it works in the space between open aggression and genuine affection. Unlike outright verbal or financial abuse, the use of guilt and obligation as weapons leaves no visible scars. Victims rarely recognize the full extent of their entrapment until they find themselves exhausted and emotionally bankrupt, unable to meet even their basic needs for rest or personal time. Helen's life is marked by constant anxiety, the dread of the next phone call, the pressure to perform emotionally, the gnawing suspicion that she will always fall short of what is demanded. When friends suggest healthy boundaries, she recoils, feeling disloyal for even contemplating such changes. The manipulator's tactics are so deeply ingrained that Helen cannot imagine a life defined by her own values or desires. The reality is that emotional blackmail through guilt and obligation is a control mechanism as sophisticated and damaging as any other. It transforms well-meaning love or loyalty into a trap, one that is self-maintaining because the victim believes they must sustain it to remain a good daughter, friend, or partner. By the time the victim realizes how much guilt is driving their life, the lines between genuine love and coerced compliance have blurred almost beyond repair. This chapter aims to shine an unforgiving light on this nuanced form of manipulation, a dynamic that, unless exposed, keeps its victims locked in service to someone else's unending need. The careful deployment of guilt and obligation, though indirect, has a remarkably corrosive effect on a person's emotional life. When compelled by manipulated guilt, emotions become hostages to fear and uncertainty. Every thoughtful impulse is recalculated. No decision is truly one's own, but is instead weighed against the possibility of provoking disappointment, anger, or further complaint from the manipulator. The victim may feel a persistent tension lodged deep inside, a relentless worry that they are always falling short, or that any attempt to prioritize personal needs will have unforgivable consequences. The result is an erosion of inner security. Anxiety and self-doubt shape daily existence. Peace of mind becomes scarce, replaced by restless vigilance and self-questioning, as if every action could unwittingly trigger a new episode of blame or emotional blackmail. Decision-making withers under the weight of such coercion. Instead of navigating life from a place of authenticity, the victim's choices become a performance, carefully orchestrated to avoid inciting guilt trips or accusations of selfishness. This pattern is repeatedly observed in those embroiled in parent-child dynamics, intimate partnerships, or close friendships, dominated by a sense of unearned duty. For instance, a case reported in the Journal of Family Psychology documents the experience of Michael, who postponed crucial career changes, romantic relationships, and meaningful travels out of overwhelming fear that his ailing parent would interpret any step toward independence as abandonment. Michael's dreams shrank while obligations multiplied, each sacrifice binding him more firmly to routines dictated not by love, but by dread of causing pain. His journey reveals how manipulators can distort someone's internal compass, so that allegiance to another's needs replaces every instinct for self-actualization. The fallout on relationships is profound and often invisible to outsiders. Although it may seem as if the victim is simply devoted, the reality is that their world is collapsing inward. Guilt and obligation narrow one's world, sometimes to a single relationship where all emotional resources are funneled. Friendships, romantic ties, and career ambitions may be sidelined, either from lack of energy or the manipulator's subtle or overt messages about the dangers of outside influences. In one study from Harvard's Department of Social Psychology, adult children of guilt-inducing parents reported isolation not just from their peers, but from their own emotions, overwhelmed by compassion fatigue and unable to distinguish between their real priorities and those demanded of them. When the victim must act as caretaker, soother, and savior, little space remains for authentic connection with anyone else. Resentment is pushed aside for obligation, and emotional exhaustion grows ever heavier. Self-esteem is ravaged by these cycles. Initially, the victim may believe their sacrifices reflect strength, loyalty, or love, but over time, the inevitable inability to meet endless demands chips away at self-worth. Repeated failures, real or perceived, in satisfying the manipulator's needs are internalized as personal inadequacy. The victim's mind becomes a running tally of failures, apologies, and failed attempts at setting limits. Manipulators exploit people's intrinsic desire to be good and valued, twisting these virtues into chains. This internal confusion is often why people become so entangled. They mistake coercion for care and self-sacrifice for genuine love until the original boundaries of self and other have disappeared. There is an urgent need to learn how guilt and obligation mask deep manipulation so that the cycle can be broken before dignity is lost completely. The next section will bring to light the overlooked warning signs embedded in everyday exchanges, equipping you to recognize these signals and reclaim authority over your own choices. Manipulators who rely on guilt and obligation to ensnare others are rarely oblivious to whom they target. They tend to possess a sharpened sensitivity for people who feel responsible for others, those who are naturally empathetic, conscientious, and eager to avoid conflict or disapproval. Often, their targets are individuals who grew up in environments where love and validation depended on pleasing authority figures or caretakers, a dynamic that leaves lasting vulnerabilities well into adulthood. Manipulators use acute listening and probing questions not with the intention to build trust, but to learn which emotional levers provoke the greatest anxiety, those soft spots ripe for the guilt-inducing narrative. The ideal candidate appears open, willing to help, and uncomfortable with the idea of ever letting someone down. Such methods unfold insidiously, masked behind concern or camaraderie. In one documented case, a woman named Priya became the primary confidant for her colleague, a charming but demanding peer. It began innocuously, a little extra help after work, an understanding ear when the colleague was overwhelmed. Gradually, Priya found herself covering more shifts and even loaning money, each time with her peer's skillful invocation of struggle, need, or loneliness. Subtle remarks such as, "I know I can always count on you," or "No one else understands the way you do," became both flattery and expectation. Priya's reluctance to ever decline grew. She reasoned that denying aid would shatter the fragile trust she had come to value. Over months, her boundaries weakened, and every acquiescence to her colleague's escalating demands was justified in the logic of moral duty blended with emotional debt. This pattern is echoed in more intimate settings. Consider Mark, whose partner often retreated into sullen silence when expectations went unmet. Rather than clearly stating needs, Mark's partner would recount stories about thankless friends or relatives and lament the lack of appreciation in the world, all while making Mark feel distinctly responsible for alleviating that unhappiness. Mark, already prone to doubt his adequacy in relationships, rationalized each sacrifice, missing outings with friends, spending more time and money, even changing aspects of his personality, as an act of true partnership. Over time, the repetitive exposure to subtle blame and the withdrawal of warmth conditioned him to view compromise not as collaboration, but as surrender to a looming threat of emotional coldness. Subtle psychological shifts anchor these manipulations: the internalization of duty that erases one's right to self-care, and the growing conflation of boundary setting with cruelty or betrayal. The more the manipulation is repeated, the more fragmented the person's self-worth becomes, and the harder it is to distinguish guilt imposed by others from the responsibility one genuinely chooses to accept. The outcome is a low-grade anxiety that vibrates beneath every choice and a persistent fear of being seen as unkind or ungrateful. Realizing that your generosity and sense of obligation have been skillfully fashioned into tools of your own restraint is unsettling but also vital for reclaiming agency. Understanding the nuanced ways guilt and obligation are weaponized is the single most important step toward resisting their corrosive influence. It is this awareness, the ability to spot emotional debts masquerading as love, that allows you to reclaim not just your boundaries, but your right to peace and personal fulfillment. This new strength sets the stage for recognizing the escalation that so often follows, how what begins as occasional guilt can spiral into cycles of relentless control and loss of freedom. If this discussion has opened your eyes to hidden patterns, consider supporting continued conversations that deepen awareness and self-defense. Chapter 4. Building Boundaries with Confidence. In a bustling workplace where collaboration is prized and hierarchies mercurial, Marissa quietly becomes the team's problem solver. She's constantly asked to stay late to finish projects, cover absent colleagues, or take on administrative details left undone by others. At first, her willingness is met with thanks and praise, a sense of camaraderie, and even a few public acknowledgments in staff meetings. But as the months wear on, gratitude begins to fade from the faces around her, replaced by expectation and disregard. Invitations to social gatherings grow scarce whenever she tries to politely decline another late night. Colleagues roll their eyes if she mentions her own workload, and Marissa finds herself desperately searching their expressions for any hint of approval or disappointment. She begins to silently question whether her worth in the group is dependent solely on what she sacrifices and how well she can stretch herself to accommodate the demands of others. Marissa's predicament is not fueled by overt hostility or obvious threats. Instead, the manipulation she faces is quiet, systematic, and relentless. Those around her have learned to test her limits. Small increases in requests are rarely resisted, so the next wave is heavier. The manipulator in this scenario is not one single person but a culture, one that rewards compliance and punishes attempts at self-advocacy. The end goal is compliance above all, maintaining an environment where personal sacrifice is applauded and those who attempt to guard their own time or energy are subtly dismissed. In an environment where harmony is only surface deep, Marissa discovers that asserting her needs is not merely uncomfortable, but almost taboo. With each unchallenged transgression, the bonds tighten around her freedom, weaving a net of dependence on others' approval for every worthwhile feeling. Victims like Marissa rarely realize how deep their entrapment runs until they are overwhelmed, staying later, taking work home, carrying guilt over what remains undone. The slow acceptance of boundary violations becomes normalized. It is no longer even recognized as a problem. The fear of letting others down or being replaced is amplified by the unspoken belief that drawing lines is selfish, uncooperative, or arrogant. The manipulative group or individual cultivates these fears with expertly timed reminders, a raised eyebrow at polite refusal, the threatening withdrawal of praise. Gradually, fulfilling everyone else's expectations supplants personal priorities, and the very notion of saying no is accompanied by chest-tightening anxiety. By the time Marissa recognizes her exhaustion, the original sense of teamwork has transformed into a cycle of self-erasure. She second-guesses her instincts, worries she is being unfair for craving balance, and finds her personal life crumbling beneath obligations she never truly agreed to bear. The illusion that setting boundaries is inherently dangerous or unfriendly is designed to keep her compliant, erasing her sense of self while convincing her the problem is hers alone. Yet the true manipulation is how easily one's willingness is transformed into obligation, and how those around her, whether deliberate manipulators or simply opportunists, are able to reap the benefits of her sacrifice without ever meeting her halfway. It is a silent lesson in captivity by consensus, revealing just how necessary the confidence to set and defend boundaries truly is. When people are unable to establish boundaries with confidence, the consequences reverberate through every aspect of their lives. Emotionally, they are haunted by unease. Each day begins with an undercurrent of anxiety, knowing that new demands or unreasonable expectations are sure to arise. A subtle dread replaces joy as individuals brace themselves for requests they cannot refuse or obligations they must absorb. This persistent self-sacrifice wears away at the core, leading not only to exhaustion but also to an internal erosion of identity. The once content and engaged person is now plagued by resentment, yet struggles to articulate it, fearing such feelings mean they are selfish or ungrateful. A sense of helplessness grows, convincing them they have little choice but to give in. Decision-making for those trapped by boundary violations becomes paralyzed and confused. Instead of confidently weighing options based on personal values or realistic commitments, the process becomes clouded by a gnawing preoccupation with others' opinions and reactions. A person like Marissa, upon being invited to take on a project or favor, does not simply consider her time and workload. Instead, she rehearses scenarios in her mind, running through what others might think if she declines, or whether her refusal will undo relationships she relies upon or derail her standing in the group. Psychologists have described this as anticipatory compliance, a conditioned reflex born from frequent breaches where attempting to assert oneself only led to increased tension, criticism, or ostracization. The result is a learned helplessness, where self-advocacy is consistently overridden by habit and misplaced guilt. Relationships become imbalanced under these dynamics. Powerful studies out of the University of Michigan demonstrate that individuals who cannot assert or maintain boundaries report significantly lower relationship satisfaction, as well as strained social connections. These relationships lack reciprocity. Needs are not discussed or negotiated, but instead fall entirely to the person least likely to initiate conflict. In one reported case, a man known for helping friends with any crisis found, after years of rarely saying no, that none of those friends were available when he went through his own hardship. This abrupt recognition often leads to bitterness and deep sadness, the realization that the supposed friendships were heavily one-sided and dependent on ongoing self-sacrifice for the benefit of others. The impact on self-esteem is pernicious and enduring. Each time yes is uttered against one's better judgment, a subtle message is internalized. My needs do not matter as much as others. Over time, this belief becomes a fixed part of self-perception, reinforcing the idea that worth is earned only through constant giving and self-denial. One study in the Journal of Counseling Psychology found that chronic boundary violators often presented with symptoms strikingly similar to depression, not due to chemical imbalance, but as a result of deep living out of sync with one's true values and needs. The act of not defending boundaries teaches people to become invisible in their own lives, erasing ambition, autonomy, and even hope. Individuals often fall for these tactics because society prizes agreeableness and often punishes assertiveness with labels of difficult, selfish, or uncooperative. Many have been raised to put others first at all costs, equating personal sacrifice with moral good. Manipulators thrive when cultural beliefs blend with personal insecurities, crafting a perfect storm that keeps confidence and self-protection beyond reach. Understanding how violating boundaries is not simply rude or inconvenient, but a systematic assault on well-being, emotional, social, and psychological, is vital. In the next section, we will illuminate the nearly invisible red flags and early warning signs that boundary violators deploy, tools that, once recognized, can help reverse the slow fading of self. Those who routinely breach boundaries often possess a keen instinct for detecting individuals predisposed to compliance. Rather than seeking out the most assertive or aloof, they gravitate toward those with compassionate tendencies, high conscientiousness, or an ingrained desire to avoid conflict. Such targets, frequently shaped by their early environments or social conditioning, display small signals: a quick willingness to offer help without hesitation, nervous laughter when overwhelmed by requests, or lingering on justifications when attempting to say no. Manipulative coworkers, friends, partners, or authority figures learn to home in on these habits, slowly establishing a cycle of ask and comply that unfolds well before the target fully realizes what is happening. Take the example of Sharon, a recent graduate taking her first office job. Nervous about making mistakes and keen to impress, she accepts every extra assignment handed to her by her supervisor. Over time, her polite demeanor and tireless effort become an unspoken invitation for others to offload tasks and minor emergencies her way. Her initial compliance is met with flattery, comments about how reliable or indispensable she is. Yet subtly, flattery slips into expectation. A turning point comes when she hesitates to accept a late-night assignment, only to be met by disappointment and a veiled suggestion that refusing lets the whole team down. Each time Sharon agrees, despite her discomfort, she overrides her intuition in favor of reassurance and belonging. The slow pivot from gratitude to resentment marks the beginning of emotional distancing, as the realization sets in that she is expected to prove her worth repeatedly with sacrifice. Patterns of this dynamic also emerge in personal relationships. Consider Alan, whose long-term partner weaponizes minor grievances to obligate him. Whenever Alan voices fatigue or asks for space, his partner recounts all the ways Alan previously fell short or the sacrifices she herself has made. Defensive and unsure, Alan finds himself apologizing and making amends for trivial issues, as if every request for autonomy was itself a betrayal. Over months, Alan loses confidence, dreads confrontation, and instinctively suppresses his needs to ease household tension. Each small erosion of his boundaries masks itself as a one-time accommodation, but they accumulate into a pattern that leaves him constantly depleted and dependent on conflict avoidance to maintain peace. The psychological shifts in such situations are gradual but profound. Targets start to experience an internal dialogue heavily influenced by others' reactions. What if I let them down? What if I'm seen as lazy, selfish, or cold? As outside validation grows more important, these individuals further disconnect from their core values and the basic right to prioritize health and happiness. Doubt replaces certainty, and the permission to rest or say no seems impossible without guilt or fear of rejection. Over time, this training in compliance rewrites fundamental beliefs about what is reasonable to accept and what is not, building barriers to future resistance and making it easier for others to advance new intrusions. Knowing how manipulators identify and prime their targets is not merely intellectual, it is foundational for reclaiming one's power. When you learn to detect these patterns in your own story, you begin to build immunity against cycles of depletion and surrender. Developing awareness is the necessary first step toward dismantling old scripts and introducing boundary setting as an act of self-respect rather than defiance. This prepares the ground for the next exploration, how the pattern intensifies and turns boundary concessions into deeper cycles of emotional and practical dependence. If these observations have resonated with your experience, please consider subscribing and joining us for deeper dives into empowerment and real defenses against hidden manipulation. Chapter 5. Reclaiming Peace and Identity. On the surface, Daniel's life appears organized, even enviable. His home is neat, his responsibilities are met, and his partner, Camilla, is admired by many for her charm and attentiveness in social situations. Behind closed doors, though, Daniel's own sense of self has faded beneath the weight of constant negotiation and indirect control. What started as subtle gestures, Camilla choosing his clothes for events, suggesting which friends he should keep close, gently coaching him on how to speak or act, gradually expands until Daniel rarely makes decisions without running them by her first. Routine pleasures Daniel once took for granted, like listening to his favorite music or going out with old friends, have become fraught exercises in managing Camilla's moods and unspoken disapproval. Meanwhile, Camilla's genuine support is always conditional. Her warmth recedes when Daniel strays outside her designed parameters, replaced with brief silences, heavy sighs, or carefully disguised comments that slice at his confidence. Camilla's ultimate goal is an all-encompassing emotional control. Her satisfaction is measured by how deeply Daniel seeks her approval and adapts his life around her comfort and sensibilities. Daniel's isolation is subtle but total. He tells himself he's compromising for the sake of peace and believing that these accommodations are a natural part of intimacy. In reality, though, the boundaries that once protected his independence have dissolved. The shift is so gradual that Daniel barely notices the give-and-take dynamic transforming into a unidirectional flow. Situations that once reflected negotiation now cater strictly to what will avoid Camilla's displeasure. Daniel shrinks back from conversations that might trigger even gentle questioning, while invitations from friends become increasingly rare. Either deflected by Camilla's excuses or quietly discouraged until Daniel simply stops reaching out altogether. Like many in similar entanglements, Daniel initially failed to grasp the extent of his entrapment. Suggestions from confidence to push back or just say no feel impossible, for the cost of even subtle rebellion is an almost tangible tension in the air. Withdrawal of affection, icy silences, or accusations about his lack of gratitude. Gradually, the effort of maintaining his own personality grows too exhausting. He relinquishes his hobbies little by little, feels out of place in his own groups, and internalizes the notion that only by aligning his desires entirely with Camilla's can he maintain household harmony. Peace, under these conditions, becomes a bargaining chip and never a birthright. In the process, Daniel's identity erodes, replaced by habitual self-policing and a constant search for permission. The tragedy behind such stories is not just the loss of autonomy, but the chipping away of inner peace, a state that can make recovery seem distant or even unattainable. Few people appreciate the depth of exhaustion caused by constantly monitoring another's emotional climate, or the psychological toll paid for sacrificing one's own joys and principles in a silent exchange for temporary approval. Daniel's situation stands as a quiet warning. Unless the illusion of security offered by emotional submission is challenged, every concession carves away a little more freedom, leaving only the shell of the person he once was. Now, reclaiming both peace and identity begins with the hardest work of all, recognizing what has been lost and daring to imagine a return to self. When a manipulator erodes a person's identity and peace, the consequences go far deeper than daily irritation or discomfort. Emotionally, the victim's inner world spirals into chronic anxiety and quiet despair, both of which can be difficult to recognize amid the effort to keep up a facade of normalcy. It soon becomes nearly impossible to distinguish fleeting moments of calm from the brittle peace maintained by compliance. The constant need to anticipate and accommodate the manipulator's moods leads to emotional exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness that persists even when things appear calm on the surface. Over time, joy fades from the most basic activities. The victim becomes hypersensitive to conflict and grows conditioned to minimize their own preferences in pursuit of an uneasy truce. This pattern repeats across all spheres of life, as simple pleasures become clouded by worry and a creeping doubt as to whether happiness is ever possible again. Decision-making, once an outlet for self-expression, loses its shape and strength amid manipulation. Each time the victim consults the manipulator, or preempts them altogether, everyday choices feel weighted with consequence. No decision, however trivial, is detached from the question, will this make them upset? For example, a survivor named Alma, whose former partner dictated everything from restaurant choices to how laundry was folded, described a pervasive sense of paralysis after their breakup. She realized she had forgotten what she actually liked, having spent so long curating small decisions for approval rather than contentment. This kind of chronic uncertainty narrows future possibilities and pulls the individual deeper into dependence, inhibiting both risk-taking in pursuit of new experiences and the ability to advocate for one's own needs. Relationships fracture both internally and externally under this kind of manipulation. Studies from the field of clinical psychology show that ongoing emotional control breaks up supportive social networks as much as it erodes the contours of the victim's own heart. Loved ones, sensing a change, may gently withdraw when they perceive the manipulated person is no longer present or defensible, unable to show vulnerability or assert true desires. The victim, increasingly out of step with themselves, finds connection replaced by isolation, or by relationships that mirror the old power dynamic and re-entrench compliance. In a clinical case, a young man named Eric experienced social isolation as his romantic partner gradually sowed suspicion toward his close friends, undermining his trust with insinuations and manufactured grievances. By the time he recognized the pattern, his friendships had faded or become hostile, and his own identity felt porous, a mask he adapted for peace rather than belonging. Self-esteem is quietly dismantled by these forces. Repeatedly conceding one's own priorities teaches the mind a cruel logic. Your needs comprise a threat, or, worse, are so trivial as to deserve suppression. The belief that personal peace and happiness can only be achieved by erasing oneself becomes self-fulfilling. Research reported in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology demonstrates that persistent emotional manipulation in relationships directly correlates with heightened rates of depressive symptoms, chronic anxiety, and a diminished sense of self-worth. Victims internalize this paradigm not out of weakness, but out of an increasingly desperate hope that appeasement will restore harmony and approval, even if it costs their authentic self in the process. People fall into these traps because manipulators move gradually, exploiting natural desires for security, love, and unity, mixing acts of kindness with subtle attacks on individuality. In the blindness created by hope, victims trust the false promise of conditional peace until nearly all sense of who they are has faded. Recognizing these patterns is not a simple step. It is a revolution, compelling us to revisit every boundary surrendered. In the following section, we will uncover the seldom seen warning signs that distinguish healthy compromise from the slow theft of self, tools to help reclaim your own peace and identity before they are lost to another's design. Manipulators intent on dissolving the peace and identity of others typically select their targets with methodical precision. They watch for those who show signs of openness, empathy, and a pronounced willingness to accommodate, traits that in a loving context are the foundation of intimacy, but, in the hands of a manipulator, signal where to apply pressure. Individuals who hesitate before voicing their preferences, easily apologize for perceived slights, or defer during group decisions are quietly marked as especially susceptible. The manipulator tests boundaries and collects psychological data, taking note of the ways their target reacts when subtle demands are made. If an individual moves to restore harmony quickly, sidesteps confrontation, or appears eager to be accepted, these responses become blueprints for future manipulation. Consider the example of Simone, an artist whose confidence in her creative vision faltered after moving in with her boyfriend, Leo. Initially, Leo was supportive and encouraging. Gradually, however, he began critiquing her art more frequently, never directly harsh, but employing backhanded compliments or claiming he only wished to help her grow. When Simone considered a gallery show, Leo focused on every hypothetical that could go wrong, stressing the embarrassment she might feel if the event failed or dismissing the odds of acceptance. With each small concession Simone made, canceling an exhibit, changing her style to suit Leo's feedback, apologizing for having her own schedule, she experienced tiny fractures in her sense of self. Over time, she stopped reaching for opportunities altogether, having been convinced it was safer to avoid disappointment and let Leo guide her aspirations. A similar dynamic played out in the workplace for Michael, whose supervisor operated with manipulative finesse. Rather than setting clear expectations, the supervisor used insinuations and comparisons, suggesting implicitly that Michael's efforts would never measure up while highlighting the superior results of colleagues. Requests for days off were accepted coldly with a hint of resentment, and celebratory moments were subtly overshadowed by reminders of missed chances or small errors. Michael began to internalize criticism as failure, grateful even for neutral feedback, believing that minor approval must be earned at the cost of constant vigilance. He became risk-averse, hesitating to assert ideas in meetings or take on projects unless specifically asked, his original innovation dampened by growing self-doubt. These scenarios illuminate the psychological shifts that begin slowly but gain momentum in manipulated relationships. Targets transition from confidence to caution, from believing in their right to fulfillment to seeing every pursuit as a threat to harmonious coexistence. They start making choices not based on desire, talent, or joy, but to sidestep disapproval and preserve a fragile detente. What sets this cycle apart is that eventually, the manipulated person struggles to distinguish between their own true inclinations and the conditioned habits of appeasement and retreat. The internal voice that once celebrated ambition and authenticity is replaced with a chorus of doubt and second-guessing, every new challenge seen through the filter of risk to another's approval. Knowing how manipulators identify and prime their targets is essential for preempting further erosion of identity and peace. Becoming aware of the subtle tactics and self-erasing habits enables the first necessary separation between one's authentic self and the roles manipulated by external forces. This knowledge alone will not restore identity, but without it, resistance remains just out of reach. As we move deeper, the next section will reveal how cycles of increased control ensnare victims and what it truly takes to break free. For more insights and support on your journey to self-recovery, consider connecting and continuing this exploration together. Chapter 6. Living with an Independent Heart. Mara always believed that devotion and selflessness defined both love and loyalty. In her marriage, she nurtured each moment, handled finances, sacrificed personal interests, and gently absorbed her husband's moods, so silence never became a storm. The arrangement crept forward gradually, control given inch by inch, the cost of family peace measured against unnamed anxieties she could never diagnose. Over the years, Mara stopped inviting friends over without consulting her husband, gave up on a career she once loved, and tailored her evenings around the subtle clues in his conversations. He was masterful at masking suggestions as mutual decisions. When Mara shared an opinion that didn't align with his, he nodded thoughtfully, then looped back a day later with logic that unraveled her argument, always ending with, "You know what's best." When Mara's mother died and she expressed her grief, his comfort was edged with questions about whether being strong meant not dwelling on sadness. Whenever Mara wavered between self-care and yielding, her instincts were quietly redirected toward compliance, a process she described to herself as compromise, but in truth was slow surrender. Her husband's ultimate goal stretched far beyond wishing Mara well. It was securing her constant surrender of self. The web of control shimmered with invisible threads, autonomy bartered for approval, financial decisions rewritten in the name of shared responsibility, emotional needs judged against his models of strength and resilience. It felt reasonable on the surface, especially in a world where shared decisions and mutual growth are praised as ideals. Mara, like many, clung to the comfort of predictability, finding solace in routines and explanations, even as those routines shrank her life. Each time she negotiated for permission rather than acting from inner conviction, each time friends faded because she could not meet their invitations, each time she adjusted her story to downplay dissatisfaction, Mara became less herself and more the product of what someone else required. What made Mara's entrapment so potent was its familiarity. Society, friends, and even family would comment on how well-matched she and her husband seemed, how harmonious their household ran. It appeared to outsiders as collaboration, even idyllic partnership, not the subtle corrosion of individuality beneath the appearance of calm. Mara no longer trusted her private sense of unease. She shamed herself for moments of irritation or sadness, deciding that she was simply not grateful enough, or worse, not strong enough to make a marriage work. Small acts, ignoring a phone call from a friend, shelving a new book unopened, or agreeing to rearrange a day to suit her husband's plans, became ritual. With each repetition, she rehearsed not just compliance, but the suppression of her heart's own voice. Few realize the steep price paid when daily life turns into a stage for others' needs and expectations, performed at the expense of one's deepest desires and growth. The ultimate tragedy is that many victims, like Mara, only see the extent of their captivity long after inner passion and independence have dulled to a faint pulse. This insidious form of control is not mere circumstance, but a design, one that flourishes on the gradual exchange of power for security, a voice for peace. It is within this recognition that the first stirring of change is possible, for an independent heart cannot awaken until the truth of one's bondage is fully understood. The slow siphoning of independence through psychological manipulation creates lasting wounds in emotions, decision-making, relationships, and ultimately, self-esteem. Emotionally, the manipulated individual experiences a kind of quiet depletion, a shrinking capacity for authentic pleasure, a dulling of natural enthusiasm, and a persistent tension that stains even moments meant for joy. As subtle forms of compliance become habitual, anxiety grows each time an independent urge or creative desire arises, often followed by shame or guilt before the desire is even acknowledged aloud. Over time, the heart grows silent within its own chest, whispering aspirations or longings with diminished hope, believing that real peace exists only in meeting someone else's expectations. Decision-making falters under such conditions. The line between what is desired and what is permitted grows so faint that the very definition of autonomy becomes muddled. Consider the documented case of Julia, who prided herself on independence before entering a relationship with a partner skilled in gentle direction. They never directly forbade activities, but through a series of carefully placed doubts and just thoughtful advice, Julia found herself second-guessing every plan or ambition not initiated by her partner. Happy decisions eventually gave way to the exhausting labor of consulting imagined reactions. Will they approve? Will this disrupt their comfort? Studies published in the Journal of Interpersonal Relationships repeatedly found that the more a person's choices were shaped in anticipation of another's approval, the less satisfied and self-sufficient they felt, even as they attempted to rationalize their compromises as mature partnership. Relationships shaped in these conditions are pressed into unbalanced forms that deny true intimacy. Loved ones sometimes perceive the change, commenting gently, only to encounter defensive rationalizations and hollow smiles. True support systems degrade, and social isolation quietly intensifies, as the manipulated person retreats further from those who would question their growing submission. This echoes a striking case studied by Dr. Linda Perry, in which a man became increasingly cut off from his friends and family because his partner fostered the subtle belief that no one truly understands you like I do. His world narrowed as his social net vanished, leaving him dependent on his partner's mood or approval for every sense of connection or reassurance. The spiral through these forms of manipulation delivers one of the most profound assaults on self-esteem. An internal voice that once offered encouragement or gentle discipline is replaced by a critic trained by expectations and fear. Small attempts at autonomy spark waves of self-doubt, etched by countless moments of negotiation and preemptive surrender. Over months or years, individuals conditioned in this way come to accept neglect of their own dreams, health, and personal boundaries as normal, even necessary. Research from the field of relationship psychology indicates that this effect is cumulative. Every moment of silence in place of assertion becomes another brick in the wall separating self from possibility, making the rediscovery of independence appear risky or unwise. People fall for such control not because they are naive, but because the manipulator shapes an illusion of partnership or care. Blame is rarely overt. Instead, strength and self-advocacy are recast as obstinacy or unkindness, exploiting a primal yearning for security and harmony. When this system is left unchecked, individuals lose the ability to trust their instincts or imagine a different life. That is why learning to detect even the most subtle warning signs is the first and perhaps most indispensable act of reclaiming an independent heart. The next section will peel away these overlooked signals, bringing crucial practices for detecting and undoing unseen chains. Manipulators who aim to create emotional dependency and compliance are skilled in identifying ideal targets for their subtle forms of control. They are especially attuned to those who appear unusually receptive to others' needs or approval, people who show a willingness to listen, an eagerness to harmonize, or an anxiety when discord arises. Rather than overt confrontation, these manipulators use conversation as reconnaissance, probing for old insecurities and testing how quickly their subject will bend, apologize, or compromise. For instance, a manipulator may pay close attention to how often someone says sorry, seeks reassurance, or struggles to make decisions without external input. Targets are rarely those with brash independence discovered in early interactions, but more often those conditioned through experience or upbringing to view their worth through the service or happiness of others. Consider the case of Alex, who always prided himself on being the rock for his circle of friends. He shouldered others' emotional burdens with quiet stoicism and rarely expressed his personal frustrations. When Alex entered a partnership with Jordan, Jordan began with appreciation, praising Alex's reliability and loyalty. But this appreciation quickly shifted from genuine to instrumental. Jordan started making requests couched in concern. "I just need you to handle that. You're so much better at it than I am," or "It just makes me feel better when I know you've taken care of it." The requests, small at first, grew bolder as Alex acquiesced. Soon, Jordan dictated how Alex managed his time, discouraged old hobbies as distractions, and implied that relaxation without permission indicated self-indulgence or neglect. Alex's appreciation for his identity, the very traits that once brought him pride, became vulnerabilities exploited to bind him ever more tightly to Jordan's comfort and whims. In another scenario, Lenora, who entered adulthood with deep-rooted doubts about her own instincts, entered a friendship that appeared supportive. Her friend Cora offered guidance, encouragement, and admiration, always with the undertone that Lenora needed shepherding. With every disagreement or attempt by Lenora to assert a preference, Cora responded with gentle disappointment or long explanations about why Lenora was overreacting or not thinking clearly. Over the course of 2 years, Lenora, desperate to keep the peace and avoid Cora's disapproval, began second-guessing every emotion, initiative, or independent decision. The shifts were incremental. By the time Lenora realized she felt hollowed out and chronically doubtful, she was isolated and entirely dependent on Cora for approval and direction. These real-life cases illustrate the subtle yet persistent psychological modifications that underpin the manipulator's approach. The most effective manipulators do not demand obedience outright. Rather, they coax self-doubt and dependence by shaping narratives in which their needs, wisdom, or approval are always prioritized. The most chilling transformation is internal. Victims begin to internalize a belief that their heart's safety, and even their identity, cannot be held independently. Every independent thought feels unsafe. Every moment of confidence is met with a new question or lesson, and challenging the manipulator's script seems reckless or morally wrong. Understanding these strategies as calculated rather than accidental is crucial to self-defense. Recognizing the ways in which manipulators select and shape their targets enables individuals to intercept these patterns before deep dependency forms. This attitude, viewing one's own willingness to please as strength to be protected rather than leveraged for surrender, becomes the first stone in the foundation of true emotional independence. In the next section, this groundwork will be put to the test, exploring how escalating control takes root and offering pathways to break harmful cycles and reclaim autonomy. As we reach the end of this journey, remember that true independence of heart is built through awareness, courage, and the deliberate practice of reclaiming your boundaries. This book has revealed how subtle psychological manipulation erodes self-worth, blurs identity, and binds us through guilt, obligation, and the theft of personal peace. By understanding the tactics, signs, and motives behind toxic attachments, you are now equipped to recognize and resist hidden control, nurturing your inner strength and authentic self. Thank you for investing your time and energy in this important work. If this content resonated with you, please like, comment, and subscribe to Stealth Psychology for more insight and empowerment on your personal growth journey.